Good morning. Welcome to a new day in our life and our family of faith here at West Hills Baptist Church. It is a beautiful fall day outside, and I am so glad to be able to connect with you this way this morning. You know, here we are in our time of Thanksgiving when we take a real look at what it means to be grateful, what role gratitude really plays in our lives. And I have to tell you, each time I talk to our people, they tell me the same thing. I'm so grateful God continues to bless our church even during these crazy times. I know you agree. I am so grateful for each of you, not only what you mean to me, but what you mean to our church family. Will you join me in a word of prayer? God above us, God before us, God within us, be now between us a bridge across which your truth can pass. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, we pray. Amen. Our New Testament reading this morning comes from the Gospel of Luke. This is where Jesus cleanses 10 lepers. This is a familiar story to most of us, but there is deep meaning in this story that we don't always talk about, and I hope you'll hear these words as if you're hearing them for the first time. On the way to Jerusalem, Jesus was going through the region between Samaria and Galilee. As he entered a village, 10 lepers approached him. Keeping their distance, they called out, saying, "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us." When he saw them, he said to them, "Go and show yourselves to the priest." And as they went, they were made clean. Then one of them, when he saw that he was healed, when he recognized what was happening in his life, he turned back and, praising God with a loud voice, he prostrated himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him, and he was a Samaritan. Then Jesus asked, "Were not 10 made clean? But the other 9, where are they? Was none of them found to return and give praise to God except this foreigner?" Then he said to him, "Get up and go on your way. Your faith has made you well." 10 were made clean. 1 was made well. What does that mean? May God add his blessing to the reading of his word, and may the message that he intends for us become a part of us. At the last high school where I taught history and sociology, I ended up becoming really good friends with a guy in my department. And he grew up in a church that was completely different than ours. He grew up in a church that was so legalistic. This is how they described the Promise Keepers. You remember that organization, Promise Keepers? Years ago, it was for men. They would gather and have these big rallies and promise to be better husbands and better fathers. It wasn't something that I was involved with them, but I had respect for them. Anyway, this is how my friend's church described the Promise Keepers. He said they were so legalistic, they described them as compromising liberal Catholic lovers. Isn't that great? Now, that's a pretty harsh reaction to men who are trying to be better husbands and better fathers, isn't it? As this conversation unfolded with my friend, he told me that his dad had died years ago and his mother had married a man who had been divorced. And he said the people in that church treated them terribly because he had been married before. And I said, "Really? Well, why do they still go there?" And I'll never forget his response. He said, "Drew, they think they deserve it." Can you believe that? That was just mind-boggling to me. Now, what is behind that kind of thinking? In part, what is behind that kind of thinking is that you deserve to be treated that way because God is behind it. Could God possibly be more misrepresented than that? This same friend, my friend that I taught with, he got married really young, as many young people do. He was trying to figure out a way to make ends meet, so he decided to join the Air Force Reserves. And so his wife dropped him off at boot camp, kisses him goodbye, tells him that she loves him, and 3 days later, he is served with divorce papers. Can you imagine? Y'all know what military boot camp is like. A drill sergeant screaming in your face all day, and 3 days later you realize your wife didn't have the guts to say it to your face. And intentionally had you served with divorce papers 3 days into boot camp. I cannot imagine what kind of turmoil that must have caused him, especially growing up with that kind of background that would lead him to believe that either somehow God was behind it or that he somehow deserved to be treated that way. How terrible would that be? Well, any of us who have some years behind us probably experienced what it was like to be in a bad relationship. Years before I met Kim, I dated this girl I had no business dating for any period of time. And this was the year I was teaching down in Marion County. So I would teach down there during the week and then come home to Knoxville to see her on the weekends. It was a really stressful year for me, but it was a year of a lot of growth as well. But when the school year was over and I moved back to Knoxville that June, to add insult to injury that year, I found out this girl had started dating this doctor. And I was all torn up about it. Oh, this is the worst thing that has ever happened to me. I was just crushed. What did I do to deserve this? Well, y'all know how this kind of thing goes. You look back on that very differently. All of y'all know I ended up marrying someone much better looking than me, both inside and out. So I've always said, if I ever cross this doctor's path, one of these days, I've never seen him again, but one of these days, I'm going to cross this guy's path. And when I do, I'm going to shake his hand and thank him and tell him that if he ever needs a favor, doesn't matter what it is, if he ever needs a favor, he's got it. Now, let's be fair to the girl I dated as well. She would shake his hand too because she could have ended up married to a Baptist preacher, right? It could have been bad. Could have been bad. Okay, here's the thing. Do you see in your long life those pivotal moments in your past when you wished you could have taken it out on somebody, but now you wish you could thank them? Did you have those times? It might go like this. You would say to them, if it weren't for you, I would not be the person that I am now. We all have the good people we need to thank, those good people who made time for us, who taught us, who took us under their wing, that were good to us when they didn't have to be. Those are wonderful people and hopefully brought us closer to God. But there's this thing in the Bible that helps us to understand, as odd as it sounds, that we are supposed to be thankful for those times and those people who helped us grow, even if they intended to harm us in some way. This New Testament passage that we read this morning, we've probably all heard it. We remember it from our days in third grade Sunday school, and we've all heard the sermon. We need to give thanks to God. Be like the one. Don't be like the nine and just take. We need to give thanks to God. Is that as far as this story goes? Is it no deeper than an elementary school, Sunday school class? Or is something else happening here? In case you have never heard someone describe what it was like to have leprosy back in those days, they knew it was very contagious, so the only way they knew how to deal with it was to quarantine people off somewhere. But if for some reason they were not, if they encountered someone, they had to yell the words, unclean, unclean, so that the people would not get within reach of them. Now, just like cancer does sometimes today, occasionally someone would get leprosy and it would go into remission and go away. And if that happened to them, then they had to go to a priest to get a certificate to show people that they were no longer unclean. Really, almost so that they could rejoin the human race. If they were lucky enough for it to go into remission, they would have to go to the priest to prove it so that they literally could become human again. And so in this passage, 10 lepers come to Jesus. Now think about this. They all believed that Jesus could heal them. They all did exactly what Jesus told them to do. Jesus said, go show yourself to the priest and get your certificate so that you can go back to your families. One, as he is going, recognizes what is happening. And he is overcome with gratitude and praise to God. So he goes back to Jesus. He falls down on the ground, thanking him. And Jesus says the oddest thing. He says, where are the other 9? He says, your faith has made you well. 10 were healed. 1 was made well. I think another way of saying would be this: 10 were healed physically, 1 was made whole because of how he reacted to his healing. We don't know the rest of the story. We don't know what happened to the 9. We don't know what happened to this 1. But don't you know his life had to be different than the others? He had to have more meaning. It had to be deeper because he tapped into something more here. You see, we all come into the world in the same way. We all come into the world as infants, and by definition, infants only have the capacity to take. But as we become adults, especially if we become Christians, then we know that it is not supposed to stay that way. As Christians, God expects us to grow, and God expects us to give back to God, to give back to the people God places in our path. This tendency that we have, where we stop in our spiritual growth at an elementary level, it is remaining an infant emotionally and spiritually. There's a very old truth. You know me, if you've heard me preach, you know I like to quote old theologians. I'm going to go way back this morning. I'm going to quote Cicero. How far back is that? Some 50 years before the life of Christ. Cicero said this. He said, gratitude is not only the greatest of virtues, but it is the parent of all others. Do we really believe that way? That gratitude is not only the greatest of virtues, but the parent of all others? I want to share a story with you this morning that I came across several years ago. It was written by a guy named Hugh Crowther. He was a minister who became prominent back in the 80s. He became known for how he would preach about the grace of God. And he was in the habit of keeping a journal. And when he was a young married person, just married for a few years, his wife fell ill and was in the hospital in a coma. And he wrote these words. He said, "She may die before morning, but I have been with her for 4 years. I had no right to her in the first place, and I could not ask for more. What I must do is to die to this way of thinking that I ever deserved her in the first place and give up my right to her life and mine. But wait, it's morning and we are both still alive. This is a gift of joy. Dear God, thank you." I have to confess to you this morning that quite possibly my biggest fear in life is if I were to lose Kim or one of the girls. And I find it difficult to imagine that I could find the kind of strength that would allow me under those kinds of circumstances to pray to God and say, thank you. But I have seen it in my ministry over and over again. Let me ask you a question this morning. What is it that God is asking of us? In part, the answer to that question is to come to the understanding that we do not have all the answers, that we live in a world that we did not create, and we don't get to make the rules. And if we can get to that point, then we can also come to the understanding that we don't know what the last chapter is going to look like. When I was teaching sociology, I came across something I thought was very interesting, that there are some things that are common to all cultures. Think about the incredible number of cultures there are all around the world. It's hard to believe that there are things that all of them have in common, but there are some. One is that all cultures have a feast of sorts, like we have Thanksgiving. All cultures have something like that. There's another one that all cultures have in common, and that is storytelling to relate certain truths. I want to share with you this morning an ancient story about a poor Chinese farmer who only had one horse and one son. The story goes that this poor farmer only had one horse and one son. He used the horse to work the land. He used his horse for transportation. His son was his only helper on his small farm. And one day, the horse was stung by a bee, and the horse ran off into the mountains. For 3 days, the poor farmer looked for his horse, but he could not find him. Word got out in the village, and each of his neighbors came by to say, "We are so sorry for your bad luck." And the farmer said, "Who's to say what bad luck really is?" Several days later, not only did his horse return, but the horse came back with 12 more wild horses from the mountains. And the word got out in the village because he was now considered a wealthy man. And they all came by to say how glad they were for his good luck and his good fortune. And the farmer said, "Who's to say what good luck is?" Several days later, his only son tried to capitalize on their good fortune and attempted to break one of the horses so it could be ridden. And the horse threw his son off and broke his leg in 3 places. The farmer had no one else to help him work on his farm, and all the neighbors came by to tell them how sorry they were for his bad luck. And the farmer said, "Good luck, bad luck, who's to say?" In the weeks that followed, war broke out, and the empire came through the village and conscripted every able-bodied young man who was able to go fight in the war. And because this man's son's leg was broken, they didn't take him. But all the able-bodied men went to war, and every single one of them were killed. When they asked the farmer what he thought, he said, "Who's to say what good luck is, and who's to say what bad luck is?" Where in our culture would we find a story like that? I have to tell you that as Christians, if we can make it past an elementary understanding of our theology, may I suggest that we have that story in the first book of our Bible. The author of Genesis is trying to convey a deep truth to us. God says to the very first people that he wants to bless them, and they can eat of all the fruit in the garden, of all the blessings that God has to offer, but of this tree that is in the middle, don't eat from it. I got to tell you that I was a full-time minister before I began to tap into the idea that that tree was in the middle. We are supposed to put God in the middle of our lives. And if we choose to put something else there and think that we can begin to interpret what good and evil are in our lives on our own, what good luck and bad luck are, then we can find ourselves in a very dark place. The serpent comes to them and says, "You can eat from that tree. You're not going to die." So guess what? They eat it, and they don't die. But I think the author of Genesis is trying to tell us that if we think so highly of ourselves, that we think that we can accurately interpret what is good and what is bad in our lives, then it can cause a piece of us to die inside. We don't have to have too many years behind us before we can look back and see that life dealt us some kind of terrible blow, but that God took those pieces and made something beautiful out of it. Not that God caused it, but God took all those broken pieces and made something beautiful out of it. I don't ever believe that God causes bad things to happen in our lives. I do believe that we are never wise enough to accurately predict the outcome. And if we think that we are, and we allow despair to become a part of our lives, to take over our lives, then what we in effect believe in those moments is that our present circumstances are so bad that not even the Creator of all things can change it, can change how we interpret it, or more importantly, change what the final outcome is going to be. When we do suffer that sin of despair, then we are buying into the serpent's definition of good and evil. We allow something to die within us. And then what do? We spread it all around, usually to the people that are closest to us and that we love the most. In this New Testament passage that we read this morning, Jesus looks at one and says, "Where are the other 9?" Let's ask ourselves that question. Where are the other 9? We are the other 9, because there are times in our lives when we have refused to grow. Where is the one? We are the one, because God has placed a piece of Himself within us that allows us to partner with Him and cause that peace within us that has died to come back to life. That is what helps us to understand that this way of gratitude, this virtue of gratitude, can be the parent of all the other virtues. Because when we come to the understanding that no matter what has happened in our lives, that if we are still breathing, God is not done with us yet. Most of you know that Kim and I spent a few years as pharmaceutical representatives. We are very grateful for those years, and it allowed us to pay off our debts, and it gave us options. It ultimately allowed me to quit that job to go into ministry. And as you know, no industry is perfect. So having said that, we were a part of it when it was really booming. Big Pharma was a good name for it. And it got so out of control that they had to crack down on what drug reps could do. And I was definitely a part of that. We threw big, elaborate events that were ridiculously expensive. So they swung the rules all the way back in the other direction. Now these reps can do very little. But there's something else I want to share with you about that industry. The big companies have been gobbling up all the smaller companies for huge prices because the big companies didn't have enough drugs in their pipeline to maintain the profits they had in the past. So in effect, while times were booming, they were so interested in reaping the rewards that they did not spend enough time investing in the future. Another way of saying it is that they failed to give back. And I use that example to tell myself and to share with you that if all we do is take, then the time will come when we will pay a very deep price. We are not infants. And as Christians, we are expected to grow and to invest in the future. And in part, what that looks like is giving back, giving thanks to God. Honestly, being grateful for all the things that have happened in our lives and trusting in this generous God who wants to bless, that He will take what we give back and use it in ways that we have no idea. Creative ways that will perpetuate our church family and our community. My friend I told you about, whose wife served him with divorce papers in boot camp, he ended up finding a wonderful person to marry. She also had a bad first marriage. Do I think God caused their first marriages to fail? Absolutely not. But God brought them together and picked up those pieces, and now they are so happy together. And if you have ever been through something like that, you know. You almost look back on it as if it were a different person, like a whole different person. And you wish you could go back to that person and say, don't let this take you down so far. Trust that God is at work here. And as you can imagine, now my friends they're now happier than they ever thought they could be in a marriage. Now let me ask you a question. Don't we all look back on our lives that way? Don't we all want to ask that person why you let life beat you up so badly? Trust God more. Well, we can't do anything about the past. We can look back on that person and wish, but we can do something now. Understand that no matter what happens, God is going to be there for us, and God will have the last word. When it is all said and done, God is at work in our life story, taking all of the good and all of the bad and weaving them together in creative ways that are beyond our wildest dreams. We just don't know. But what we do know is that we can give back to God, and we don't have the ability to accurately predict the final outcome. But this God of hope gives us an invitation. It is an invitation for our lives to have new meaning by giving thanks and giving back and moving forward in our relationship with the living Christ. Will you take God up on this offer? Give God all of your fears and recognize that God has incredible things in store for you that you just can't predict. Dear God, we are so grateful for everything. Help us now to be made well. Amen. I have so enjoyed this time with you. And as you go today, take the kind of peace that can only come from God with you. The world is in desperate need of it. And as you go, remember, it is through the generosity of God that you were brought into this world in the first place. It is through the grace of God that you have been kept and held all the day long, even until this very moment. And it is through the love of God, fully revealed in the face of His only Son, Jesus Christ, you are changing. You are being redeemed.